Before the NBA learned how to protect young talent, it learned how to exploit it. Long before player development programs, mental health staff, or rookie transition plans existed, the league opened its doors to teenagers who were still fighting battles they did not understand. Some survived. Many did not. One of them stood 7 feet tall. In Detroit, they saw him as a miracle. A giant who could dominate grown men before he was old enough to vote. Coaches saw a franchise center. Scouts saw history. The city saw hope. What no one saw was the child still trapped inside the body. Reggie Harding entered professional basketball without college, without structure, and without a roadmap for life. The NBA celebrated the moment. America applauded the headline. Then everyone stepped back and watched. What followed was not just a fall from grace. It was a slow collision between raw talent and a system that was never built to save him. This is not a story about excuses. It is a story about timing, neglect, and a question that still haunts professional sports today. What happens when opportunity arrives before maturity? He entered the world without stability, and that absence followed him everywhere. Born in Detroit in 1942, Reggie Harding never had the chance to grow into certainty. His biological mother was still a teenager when she gave birth. Family pressure forced her to give him up for adoption almost immediately. Long before basketball, rejection became the first chapter of his life. A foster family raised him on Detroit's east side. They provided shelter, but the streets shaped him just as much as any home ever could. Neighbors gave him the nickname Baby Huey, a name that followed him into adulthood. It sounded harmless, almost affectionate, but it reflected something deeper. A boy who grew physically faster than he could grow emotionally. Basketball arrived as both refuge and identity. Around age 10, he found the game on cracked neighborhood courts where respect was earned through strength. One neighbor, Bill Irvin, recognized more than size. He saw potential and tried to guide it. He worked with him, trained him, and pushed him toward basketball as a way out. But guidance had limits when the rest of life remained unstructured. His growth was dramatic. By middle school, he stood 6'5". By high school, he kept rising until he reached 7 feet tall. At Eastern High, he was not just bigger. He was overwhelming. Opponents feared him. Crowds gathered just to see him warm up. The city began whispering his name as something special. But success came without boundaries. Teachers passed him despite his struggles with reading. Adults excused behavior they would never tolerate in other students. On the streets, his size turned into intimidation. He fought often. He bullied smaller kids. The attention fed him, but it never grounded him. When his foster parents tried to discipline him by sending him to work on a farm in northern Michigan, it backfired badly. Isolated, mocked, and racially targeted, he felt stripped of control. He stole a truck and drove back to Detroit. The court gave him probation. The newspapers gave him a reputation. From that point forward, basketball was no longer just a dream. It became a shield. Every basket made people forget what he was becoming off the court, and every excuse taught him the same lesson. Talent could erase consequences. That lesson would follow him into the NBA. History often remembers the headline, not the human cost behind it. In 1962, the NBA crossed a line it had never crossed before. Without a blueprint, without safeguards, and without understanding the psychological weight of the decision, the Detroit Pistons drafted Reggie Harding straight out of high school. No college experience. No transition period. No precedent. It was framed as opportunity. In reality, it was an experiment. Detroit believed they could turn him into their franchise centerpiece. A hometown giant with rare size and strength, capable of standing toe-to-toe with the era's dominant centers. At 7 feet tall, he did not look like a project. He looked like an answer. But the league's rules betrayed its own boldness. Because of eligibility restrictions, he could not immediately play. Instead of structure, he drifted. Semi-pro leagues, touring games, temporary locker rooms. No consistency, no accountability. The NBA had opened the door, then asked him to wait in the hallway. When he finally arrived, flashes of brilliance confirmed what scouts had believed all along. He rebounded with force. He scored with ease. Grown men struggled to move him off the block. On the court, he belonged. Off the court, he was lost. There were no rookie programs. No mentors assigned. No counselors. The league did not ask whether a teenager raised in chaos could suddenly navigate money, fame, and adult freedom. Teams expected professionalism without teaching it. For him, Basketball success only amplified old instincts. Detroit's nightlife, street connections, and familiar faces remained closer than teammates or coaches. While others studied film, he returned to environments where respect was enforced through fear. The NBA saw talent. Detroit saw potential, but no one addressed the instability beneath the surface. What should have been the beginning of a revolutionary career became something else entirely. A warning disguised as progress. The league moved faster than its own ability to protect the player it had just made history with. And once again, the gap between ability and readiness grew wider. The breakdown did not happen all at once. It happened in plain sight. When Reggie Harding finally joined the Detroit Pistons, the organization quickly realized something was wrong. Not with his talent, with everything around it. He missed practices. He ignored schedules. He treated team rules as suggestions, not obligations. On the court, he showed why Detroit took the risk. He rebounded with force. He scored through contact. Veteran players could not move him easily. But basketball only lasted 48 minutes. The rest of the day was chaos. The locker room became unsafe. Teammates whispered instead of confronting him. Guns appeared where sneakers should have been. What some tried to dismiss as jokes crossed into fear. No one knew when bravado would turn into violence. Team chemistry collapsed before it could form. The NBA stepped in, not with support, but with punishment. He was suspended for an entire season for conduct deemed detrimental to professional basketball. At the time, it was unprecedented. The message was firm and simple. Control yourself or disappear. Detroit chose distance. A trade to Chicago followed, framed publicly as a fresh start. Privately, it was an escape. The Bulls were losing and desperate. They needed a center and believed talent might outweigh risk. It did not. The same patterns resurfaced almost immediately. Arguments escalated. Threats replaced teamwork. One night, a teammate woke up to find a gun pointed at him in the dark. After only 14 games, Chicago had seen enough. They cut him loose. What followed was not rebellion. It was unraveling. The Indiana Pacers of the ABA offered one final opportunity. Even there, with lower expectations and fewer cameras, the instability remained. He produced double-doubles on the court, but authority meant nothing to him. Practices were missed. Dress codes ignored. In one moment caught on television, he threatened a team executive. That was the end. There were no exit interviews. No rehabilitation plans. No second phase. When the league closed its doors, it closed them completely. Basketball disappeared, and with it went structure, income, and identity. Drugs filled the vacuum. Heroin became routine. Arrests followed. The system that once rushed him forward now left him behind without a safety net. By the time prison became inevitable, no one in professional basketball was paying attention anymore. The league had moved on. History had been written without footnotes. What remained was a young man who had been treated like a grown professional before he ever learned how to be one. By the early 1970s, America had already made up its mind. To the media, Reggie Harding was no longer a basketball player. He was a headline. A symbol, a convenient example of what happens when talent meets chaos. Articles stopped asking questions and started delivering verdicts. He was called dangerous, irresponsible, a waste. The language was unforgiving. In a country already tense with racial division, his story fit an old narrative too well. A large black man from the inner city. Guns, drugs, violence. The context disappeared, replaced by stereotypes that felt familiar to American readers. Few writers explored adoption trauma. Fewer still asked what it meant to place a teenager from a broken environment into a professional league with no guardrails. The NBA wanted distance. The league was still fighting for legitimacy, corporate sponsors, and mainstream respect. One unstable player threatened that image. So the response was punishment, not rehabilitation. Suspensions, fines, silence. There was no conversation about responsibility on both sides. Not about teams that ignored warning signs. Not about a system that celebrated history without preparing for its consequences. The burden was placed entirely on the player, as if discipline alone could erase years of neglect. In Detroit, reactions were split. Some saw a menace who had embarrassed the city. Others saw a son of the streets, raised without tools, crushed by expectations he never asked for. Older fans remembered his high school dominance and wondered how something so powerful could unravel so completely. Nationally, there was no debate. America prefers simple stories. Heroes rise. Villains fall. Complexity makes people uncomfortable. And so his name faded from sports pages and into crime columns. The league moved forward. New stars arrived. The lesson was quietly buried. But the questions never went away. How young is too young for opportunity? Where does personal responsibility end and institutional failure begin? And why do some stories get remembered as warnings instead of tragedies? Those questions followed him into the final chapter of his life, even if no one was listening anymore. When he walked out of prison in 1971, something had changed. For the first time in years, Reggie Harding spoke about the future without anger. He talked about routine, about discipline, about faith. He went to church regularly. He ran every morning to rebuild his strength. He lined up a factory job. He reconnected with his wife and tried to rebuild the family he once took for granted. It was not redemption yet, but it was direction. Then life took its cruelest turn. His biological mother, the woman he had only recently reunited with after a lifetime of separation, was murdered by her boyfriend during a violent argument. The loss shattered what little stability he had managed to rebuild. At her funeral, he stood frozen beside the casket, overwhelmed by grief. Witnesses later recalled him quietly describing his own funeral. A Cadillac, a basketball backboard. It sounded strange, almost prophetic. 2 weeks later, on a Detroit street corner, prophecy became reality. A confrontation with a man he considered a close friend escalated quickly. What began as disrespect turned into humiliation. And humiliation, in that world, demanded violence. When the gun was raised, he did not believe it would be fired. He joked. He trusted the bond he thought they shared. The first shot did not kill him. He spoke in disbelief, asking why. The second shot did. He died the next day in the hospital, 30 years old. Even in death, the symbolism was cruel. His grave was dug too short. His coffin had to be placed at an angle. A giant who never quite fit into the world was laid to rest in a space that could not hold him. Today, his name rarely appears in NBA conversations. When it does, it is often framed as failure. But his legacy is more complicated than that. He was the league's first experiment in drafting raw youth straight from high school. And he paid the price for arriving before the system was ready. Modern player development programs, mentorship initiatives, and mental health support did not exist when he entered the league. They exist now because stories like his made their absence impossible to ignore. Reggie Harding did not become a legend on the court, but his life forced professional basketball to confront a truth it once avoided. Talent without structure is fragile. Opportunity without guidance can be dangerous. If this story stayed with you, ask yourself why. Not just what he did wrong, but what was missing when he needed it most. Some lessons are learned too late for the people who teach them.